Hello everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name's Philip. I'm a current undergraduate student at Brown University. I'm studying engineering and physics, at least for the moment. That may be subject to change. But I've pretty much, ever since I can remember, loved astrophysics, and exploring the universe. And if I can recall correctly, I think pretty much since the second year of high school, I've been involved in some way, shape, or form in astrophysics related research. So I have a big passion for it. I'm super excited to be presenting at this Intro to Astro speaker series. I hope you guys learn a little bit from it, and from not only my presentation, but obviously those to come as well. And yeah, I think let's just get a little bit into it. So I'm aware that at least from a quick glance, reading research papers maybe doesn't sound like the most interesting, the most exciting topic to be presenting on, but it actually is really, really important, especially for any of you guys that are thinking of potentially pursuing a degree, a STEM-related degree in undergraduate studies and potentially further on. For those of you that are considering joining a lab in university, reading research papers will come up time and again. And so it's actually really important to develop a pretty solid framework and foundation for how to read papers. And it's definitely something I wished I developed before I kind of got into undergraduate. It would have saved me a lot of time, but hopefully you guys will learn a little bit from it and understand by the end of this presentation how to read research papers a little bit more effectively. How do we? Okay, perfect. So, yeah, just really briefly, I'm going to talk a little bit about why we actually read research papers, what the point of reading research papers is. Then I'll talk a little about the structure of research papers and how they tend to be written. Then that should segue quite well into the strategies that exist that I've compiled for reading papers. I'll talk a little bit about how we find research papers, and then ultimately how we can utilize AI in our research paper reading. So, why read papers? Why read papers in the first place, right? I mean, if the information is already accessible through artificial intelligence, even through textbooks now that are written in a far more approachable manner that is significantly simpler than research papers, then what's actually the point? So, I don't know, a pretty classic example is, especially if any of you are considering studying physics in the undergrad level, you'll encounter special relativity at some point. And when studying special relativity, nobody reads the original 1905 paper written by Einstein that proposed special relativity. That's not a thing. That would be crazy. That would be significantly more difficult than what is now currently the strategy, which is reading a textbook on special relativity, which tends to be far more approachable. It tends to be far more simply written and intuitively explained. There are also fantastic videos and courses available on special relativity. MIT OpenCourseWare, I'm not sure if you guys have heard of that, but it's a fantastic platform that essentially shares free courses taught by MIT professors, and they do absolutely have special relativity related ones, usually combined with quantum mechanics or general relativity, but that's definitely out there. Then there's obviously fantastic YouTube videos that are also freely accessible. One of the guys I really love watching is Dr. Green. He's fantastic. Um, but 100 years ago, when special relativity was first proposed, there obviously did not exist textbooks. There wasn't an MIT OpenCourseWare video that I could watch and understand a little bit more about special relativity. There wasn't YouTube, right? So the point that I'm trying to make is that research explores the unknown. The entire point of research is that we investigate processes and relationships that we don't yet have a firm understanding of, right? And so the only way to remain at the forefront of a specific field, at the forefront of a specific area of research is to remain aware and to remain aware ultimately of what's happening there is by reading research papers. There are no textbooks that cover novel research. So that's kind of the underlying motivation for why people even bother reading research papers, even though at times it can be quite a difficult and challenging process. So let's dive maybe a little bit into the anatomy of research paper, as I like to call it. So how are they written? You'll see at the top of the screen, there are two websites that I've linked. I don't know if you guys want to type those in. I don't think they're copy pastable, but otherwise you can just follow along with this screen because I do have them up and can go to them pretty quickly. So these are just two papers I found on ADS, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But what I want you guys to do at the moment is really just look at the papers very quickly. We can kind of scroll through it together and just observe the general structure of the papers. So you'll see, okay, this has a title. It's talking a little bit about transit timing variations. You'll probably learn a little bit about the transit method in a later video. Okay, of sub-Saturn exoplanets. Okay, sure. There's an abstract. Okay, interesting. We'll move on. Okay, it looks like there's an introduction that they're talking about, then a table, and then there's some kind of data that they're presenting. Let's scroll a bit further down. Looks like there's some figures. Okay. There tends to be an analysis section. Okay, so light curve analysis, that's something in transit method that you probably will hear about later. More analysis. Let's continue scrolling. Okay, a couple of equations. Looks like there's data. Um, and then if we keep on going down, what will we find? Okay, looks like there's a summary and then some kind of concluding remarks. Also, acknowledgments and references. All right, so let's look at the second paper and try and observe whether there are similarities or not. So again, it looks like there's a title. There seems to be an abstract, some kind of introduction. If we keep on scrolling down, okay, variability in standard stars. So that looks like it might be a method, might be some kind of analysis that they're doing. Um, Okay, they're talking a little bit about that. Looks like so there's some kind of unclassified variable candidates. We continue going down. Um, and then, oh, okay, we see a discussion. And then what else do we see? Conclusion, acknowledgements, appendix, reference. All right. So hopefully after that kind of quick look, you'll have noticed that there are some similarities between those two papers. And actually, there that's not really an anomaly. You'll tend to find pretty similarly structured papers um, across academia, and I think one of the most memorable acronyms for that is IMRAD, right? So papers will usually contain an introduction, they'll contain some kind of methods section, they'll contain a results section, and then also discussion. And more specifically for papers in physical sciences, at least that I'm aware of, there will be a title. Most papers have a title. There's an abstract, which kind of summarizes what the paper sets out to do and the findings. There's an introduction, then there's a method section, and that will typically vary. So if the paper is more experimental, it'll talk about ultimately the experimental setup. If it's more theoretical, it might talk about assumptions made and computational methods potentially used. Then there's a results section, discussion, conclusion, and bibliography. So that tends to be how papers are structured. And it's important to keep in mind sort of that general structure because it will help us to identify different strategies for reading papers. All right. So now that we have a better understanding of what research papers tend to look like, we can dive deeper into how we actually read them. And I think for some of you, that might sound like a little bit of a stupid statement, right? I mean, surely there's not much more to it than just reading it, but that's actually not the case. And hopefully, just from the little scan that we did of those two papers, you'll realize that they're actually quite complex. There was a lot of detail. It had a lot of complicated looking information. There were a lot of diagrams. There seemed to be a lot of analysis. And so the reason why papers tend to be quite difficult to read and why doing something like reading front to back often doesn't work is because papers tend to be a culmination of months, sometimes even years of work. And papers are written in the perspective of the researchers that have been grappling with this problem for a significantly longer time than we have. So it often helps to approach reading a paper with a specific strategy in mind. And if there is one thing that I can tell you from experience, and I think a lot of people can tell you this, is that reading a research paper front to back is not the way to go. By the time that you get usually to the end of the introduction, you're already so swamped with the information that you've encountered that you'll be able to retain pretty little else. And by the time you force your way through the end of the paper, it's very possible you realize it's not even related to what you're attempting to do. So that wastes a significant amount of time. It wastes resources. It wastes effort. And so, at least, in the next couple of slides, I'll attempt to show you a little bit about how we can approach that in a more structured and a more efficient way. So there's obviously no right or wrong way of reading research papers. And definitely once you expose yourself to more of them, you'll kind of develop your own feel, your own intuition. You'll become comfortable with your own method. But especially for those of you that are first starting out, There are a couple of strategies that I can recommend that I think will be quite helpful, at least in helping to gain some intuition for how to read research papers. These strategies were not developed by me. They've existed on the internet for quite some time, but I thought it might be helpful to summarize. And they are not reading a paper front to back. So there are two methods which I affectionately call the multiple pass approaches, which essentially involve two things. One, we're not reading the paper front to back, we're actually reading it multiple times, but different sections of it. And we're attempting to determine whether the paper is actually worth reading or not. So one of the most classic methods of reading research papers is by someone called Dr. Keshav. He developed something called the three-pass method, which I've linked the research paper that he wrote on it below. I think it's probably the second link. You can type that out, or I think once the slides are shared, you'll probably have access to it. Um, and so I'll just summarize it quickly here. You can read it if you want to. I would recommend it's a pretty informative read and it'll help you for sure. But essentially, what he proposes is in the first pass. So the first time you read the paper, you really just want to scan through the title. You want to look at the abstract, maybe read the introduction a little bit, look at the headings, and then kind of read through the conclusion. And that should give you a pretty decent understanding of what the paper is talking about and whether it's even worth reading it. So if you decide ultimately that the paper is worth reading, we then move on to the second pass, and that takes a little bit longer. Here, you read the paper in greater detail. You may focus more on the figures and attempt to determine what exactly they're showing you. Usually, great research papers should be comprehensible just by the figures that they're presenting, but you won't always encounter great research papers, so it's important to, certainly in the second pass, read through significantly more of the information provided, look at the figures, make sure you understand those, but again, avoid any very intricate detail that's not necessary for a general level understanding of the paper. And then ultimately, if you decide after that that you really do want to understand the entirety of it, you then move on to the third pass, and this can take um, anywhere between, quite frankly, like 1 and 5 hours, but depending on your maturity level and how much exposure you have to papers, and here you, and also familiarity with the topic, quite frankly, and here you want to read through it rigorously and closely. You want to essentially evaluate all the assumptions that are made. You want to determine what the shortcomings are of the paper and how potentially it may be approved. So that's sort of Dr. Kashab's method, which I highly encourage you guys to try out at some point. Now, it's important to note that, yeah, it's absolutely time consuming, but it still is more efficient than reading a paper front to back multiple times. At least here you'll retain the information and actually understand what you're reading. And so I also decided to include something that's a little bit more simpler, that's less time consuming. It therefore is less rigorous, but especially when you guys are starting out, I think it's also a fantastic method to take a look at. And so this is actually something I found on Medium, but it resonates with me, and I think you guys might appreciate it too. And similarly, it involves attempting to determine whether it's actually worth reading the paper. So in the first pass, again, you just quickly scan through the title, you look at the abstract, read through the conclusion, and then by that, you're pretty much able to judge whether or not the paper is worth reading, whether it's related to your interests or not. If it is, we continue with the second pass. We read the abstract. Sorry, we've already read the abstract and the conclusion. We now proceed to reading the introduction. We might look at the figures, again, attempt to determine what's happening there. And ultimately, if we decide that it's still worth reading and that we're interested in it, then we do something similar to the third pass mentioned in the three pass, the original three pass method, where we really dive more deeply into it. So that should give you a relatively thorough understanding of how to actually read papers. Um, and I think we can now probably move on to onto finding papers. So you might be wondering where research papers actually are on the internet. All papers are, or most papers that have been peer reviewed, tend to be published in journals. But because research in a particular field is distributed over a variety of journals, it actually doesn't really make sense to look at journals when you're attempting to find papers related to what you're interested in. And so instead, what I recommend is finding either a database that compiles vast numbers of papers, or using something like AI enhanced search tools. So if we can move on here. Databases are extremely useful because they allow for specific search parameters, and so they'll filter based on kind of what you're looking for. Now, probably the primary data system that's available for astrophysics is called the Astrophysics Data System. It's pretty simple, ADS. You just type it in the browser, you'll find it. It's publicly available. And actually, we can probably take a little look at it. I have it up here. Anybody can really access it if you guys type in astrophysics data system. And so you'll see that there's a bunch of different search parameters you can enter. Yeah, you'll see author, first author, abstract year, full text. Continue scrolling down. I mean, this is really something that I think you just need to try out. You'll kind of get a hand and understand a little bit better how to use it just through practice. But let's say, okay, apparently I already have a keyword in here, which is great. Let's do something like radial velocity. That's a method of exoplanet detection that I think you guys will encounter at some point. Um, let's see. All right, perfect. So you enter whatever your search parameter is. You can have multiple, obviously, and it will filter the papers in the data system based on this search parameter. And you'll see that there's a ton of results. They can be grouped based on different characteristics. And yeah, I don't know if we, for instance, go on this one, let's say, uh, it will provide you with the title of the research paper. This will usually be the abstract, and then here are all the authors. And you'll see in the right-hand corner, this is where you can actually access the paper. So this is definitely worth noting. Most papers on something like the ADS will contain a preprint version and then a version that's been published in a journal. So in this case, the IOP is where the paper was published in. So preprint refers to papers that have not been peer reviewed yet. So this will have been an early stage version of the paper before it was peer reviewed and published in a journal. But the reason why I mention it is because if you don't have institutional access, papers that are published in journals are usually blocked by a paywall. You can, especially with the astrophysics data system, access the non-peer reviewed version, which will always, occasionally have minor variations, but it's free to access, and you can read through that. And obviously, you'll see that in the IOP, that brings you to the journal. And then if you don't have institutional access, you may not be able to access the paper. So that's the ADS for you. I highly encourage you to explore with it. And actually, in the homework that I've assigned, you'll be doing a little bit of it. But it's a really cool tool. It's super handy, and I highly recommend you guys use it. And then there obviously also is the ability to search for relevant papers with AI. So often when I first start a search for a new project, the search parameters in the ADS actually don't allow for enough flexibility. And so I'll resort to AI. For me, I actually really enjoy using Perplexity. It provides a list of different files, or rather articles that it's searched through to kind of fulfill your request. And it works fantastic for me. I absolutely recommend you guys try it out too. And so based on the prompt I enter in the chatbot, it will suggest a handful of papers that I can then scan through with the methods that we discussed. I'll ultimately, through that, then gain a broad idea of what area I'm researching. And then with this understanding, I can either then resort to a data system because I now am aware of what search parameters I want to enter. Otherwise, I can look through potentially reference papers in the handful of papers suggested by the AI, or I can refine the search. So I think those are kind of the two primary ways that you can search for papers, at least that I've been using so far. And then finally, I just want to quickly cover how AI might be utilized when we read research papers to make it an even more efficient process. So, as I mentioned above, AI is particularly useful when we attempt to find papers. Now, it's probably an important caveat here to mention that I say this from the perspective of an undergraduate student, right? I work at a lab where often my assignments will be drastically different. I don't have research expertise yet or expertise in a specific area. And so it is very helpful to use something like a chatbot to very quickly identify a series of papers that help broaden my understanding of a certain field or of a certain category of a field that we're working in. And I think Maybe as you advance through the ages and you do gain expertise in a certain field, that becomes less relevant. But certainly, if you guys are starting out, starting undergraduate studies, beginning to work in a lab, it is a very helpful tool. I also think if we consider the multiple pass approach that I mentioned earlier, it is very possible to use AI here, at least in the first pass. But frankly, I think reading the abstract, the conclusion, and the introduction is more than enough to gain a thorough understanding of what the paper is talking about. And oftentimes, it'll be very similar to what the chatbot provides. So it's definitely possible to use it here. I'm not entirely sure if it's necessary. You guys can go around and experiment with it, but I do think that at least initially, try using the multiple um, pass method, and frankly, even without AI, uh, just because it is a pretty great way of gaining an intuition for how to read papers. And then thirdly, and you will absolutely encounter this when you read research papers, is very often you'll stumble across terms that you might never have heard of. And here it is very useful to use AI because it can provide some kind of overview summary of what that term is, so that you're able to continue reading the paper without possibly having to do a deep dive into another area to fully understand what they're talking about. So it absolutely is very helpful there. And that pretty much wraps up the presentation. Again, I think a lot of it is trial and error. You have to go out, you do it yourself. And so that's, I think, sort of what I'm trying to do in this assignment. It's not a massive assignment. I also haven't, I'm not entirely sure, Dr. Dai, if you want to create a Google Sheets as well for students to upload their answers here. But essentially, what I was thinking is I have attached these four papers, or the titles at least, and I'd like you to go into the ADS and find them. It's not a very difficult task. Um, and ultimately, using this multiple pass method, I'd like you to read them. You don't have to read them in very great detail. A lot of it is definitely far more advanced than I think what you're comfortable dealing with, and that's absolutely okay. But what I'd love for you guys to do is, after reading these papers, attempt to determine which paper proposes a novel method that could be used to attract the attention of and ultimately communicate with extraterrestrial intelligence. So it's a little bit of a fun task. It's a little bit out there. Maybe not necessarily related to reality exactly, but it's interesting, and I think the papers are interesting. So that is what's been assigned, at least from my side, for this week. And I hope you gained a little bit from this presentation. Thank you so much for listening.